Finally, my last introduction is to a longtime friend and someone who I've admired very much, Ross Anderson. And sometimes you speak of people as being experts in the technology field, and Ross is certainly a leading global expert in the technology field, but I think his great attribute is his ability to understand the relationship between technology and public policy, and to understand how governments respond or don't respond to some of the challenges created by new technology. And in this area as well, Ross Anderson is one of the leading experts in the world. So we're grateful to have you here.
Well, Mark, thanks for the kind words. My background is that I work in a computer science department. I have a maths degree. I became a hardware engineer and eventually a systems guy. And we used to work on the technological side of security, but about 10 years ago we began to realize that you had to do the economics as well, because many systems fail because the person who's guarding the system isn't the person who suffers when it fails. And there may very often be a role for public policy in dealing with these market failures. Now, over the past 10 years, we've built security economics into a field with over 100 practitioners. We just did our conference in Fairfax over the last couple of days. Three big reports that we've produced were one in February on the resilience of the internet. How do you go about incentivizing transit providers, for example, to provide sufficient surplus capacity to keep the internet resilient? Another was on cybercrime policy, which came out in 2008, which looked at issues such as transparency, fraud reporting, and the international cooperation that Dr. Lowe was just talking about. Both of these were done for ENISA, the European Network and Information Security Agency. In 2009, we did one on database state, which was for the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, and this looked at issues of privacy in public sector systems. And I suppose I should talk a little bit more about this, because we had here on Monday a pre-conference on healthcare IT privacy. And this brought home to me the fact that America is in the same position now that Britain was in the mid-1990s. You've had a stimulus bill that has pumped several $1 billion into the health IT industry, and this reflects an initiative by the John Major government in the mid-1990s, which was then followed up by Tony Blair's government and caused all sorts of problems. The fundamental problems of health IT turn out to be remarkably similar to the fundamental problems of national intelligence, which we saw, for example, with the WikiLeaks issue, which Tim was discussing some minutes ago. The problems are of scale, of context, and of control. And one of the most difficult of these is scale. In the old days, you might have 25 staff at a doctor's office having access to the records of 10,000 patients, or perhaps 1,000 staff at a hospital having access to the records of a few 100,000 patients. When you aggregate these through health information exchanges or national electronic patient record databases, the numbers scale in a way that you lose control. For example, in Scotland, where I grew up, the government built an emergency medical record database covering 5 million people, which was accessible to 140,000 doctors, nurses, ambulance drivers, social workers, and policemen. Pretty well as soon as it was put online, the medical records of the Prime Minister, of the First Minister of Scotland, of sports personalities, celebrities, TV newsreaders were accessed by doctors who had no right to do this, and there was a huge scandal. But of course, the system couldn't be fixed because the architecture was wrong, right? The architecture involved too many people needing access to too many people's records in order to do their work. Now, one of the things that we had been warning against in our database state report, and in fact we were talking about at a meeting in London just last week, was that England has created a medical records database for research called the Secondary Uses Service, which contains data on 50 million people and is accessible in theory to about 800,000 people. That's about the same number of people who have top secret clearances in the USA. So what happened? Well, I predicted last week that eventually a professor would leave a laptop on a plane. And on Tuesday, we got the sad news that this had already happened. 20 laptops were stolen from a medical research facility in London. One of them contained the records of 8.6 million people, and this issue is now in the tabloid press. What can one do as a policy matter to put a brake on the people who wish to aggregate data, and mostly it's for administrative convenience rather than research benefits? Well, one of the interesting things we found out in the UK 2 years ago when we were starting to campaign against this was an intervention from the Catholic Bishops' Conference. They took the view that religious women must unconditionally have the right to forbid the use of their gynecological data in research on contraceptives or abortifacients. Now, that was quite unexpected, and it may in fact turn out to be a much more powerful political force in the USA if you can mobilize it. In Britain, something like 6 to 7% of people go to an act of public religious worship every week, whether it's a church or a mosque or a synagogue. In America, I believe that's over half. So if you can get not just the Catholic Bishops' Conference, but the Southern Baptists and the Orthodox Jews and the Muslims and so on, aware of the consent to sharing medical records for research issue, then you could find an extraordinarily powerful tool for lobbying here in Capitol Hill. The final issue that we learned from dealing with medical records in the UK is that control matters. And one of the things that we have seen with the centralization of medical records is that records become hosted. They become like Google Docs. Now about half of the family doctors in the UK no longer keep their records on the premises on a computer that they own. Instead, they get a service subsidized by a loving, caring government whereby the records are kept in a server farm run by a company such as BT or EMIS. How is this going to change the world? Well, about 4 years ago, there was a police officer went to the lady who runs one of our pregnancy charities and demanded information on all her patients under the age of 16. Our law permits this. A policeman is entitled to seize anything which is, quote, actual evidence of a crime, unquote. And as the age of consent is 16 in our country, a pregnant 15-year-old is evidence of a crime. Now, the lady in question told the policeman to take a hike, see you in court. And the police didn't persist. If they had done, I expect the European Court of Human Rights would have overturned the law in that particular context. But this gives me a lot of pause for thought. What happens if in 4 years' time, when most of our medical records sit on the server farms operated by government contractors, the police try again, and instead of facing a 50-something-year-old gynecologist who sees her professional ethics, her self-esteem, her business model, everything on the line, they approach a 24-year-old deputy shift supervisor at British Telecom with the request for the data. So these are the three things that matter: scale, context, and control. Where they come together is architecture. The question of whether you have separate servers sitting in all your hospitals, which then exchange information through health information exchanges, or whether you simply pay Microsoft to put the whole lot on a server farm somewhere in Oregon. Architecture matters. It's where the engineering, the economics, the law, and the policy all come together. And our experience of 15 years tussles in the UK is that an understanding of architecture tends to be absent the first 1 or 2 times round the track. The policymakers don't understand that they need to have technology people involved in making the top-level decisions. At our government, for example, our government's chief information officer, who is a very nice and capable guy, is unfortunately in a position of reporting to someone who reports to the cabinet secretary. So he's not at the table when the top-level decisions are being made. That's wrong. You need a government CIO who's sitting there in the White House around the table when the drafts are being roughed out to be sent to Congress or wherever. So it's about incentives, it's about architecture, and it's also possible to learn from experience elsewhere. So for goodness sake, as you go about doing the modernization of systems like healthcare, don't repeat the mistakes that we made. And finally, I might point out that yesterday we had a wonderful paper at Weiss from our keynote speaker, Alessandro Acquisti, who did some statistical research across different US states and come up with the wonderful fact that those states which have got strong privacy laws, which require consent for the sharing of personal health information, found that health information exchanges grew and prospered more quickly than they did in those states which had no privacy controls. So if anybody turns up and says, we can't have privacy because it will cost us innovation, then tell him that's a load of rubbish. And if the person in question is a Republican congressman, then refer him to the Southern Baptist Congress.
Thank you very much, Ross. We're going to go to some questions in a moment, but as I said, the news report this morning on NPR just seems so timely to our session. I wanted to be able to introduce that to the discussion as well, and I understand that the people in the AV have queued that up. So if you folks are set to go and can give us a little morning edition, we'd appreciate it. Or if not, we can do it here. Okay, we're going to try to do it here, which was our original plan.
It's not very on the screen.
Wait, no, we just need the audio.
The company's technical director says the link.
Martin, stop eating.
But we also have a story here on Greek rioting leads to political turmoil. So, while we're working on the AV, I think maybe the best thing we might do at this moment is actually to open it up to audience questions, because we've had such interesting and provocative presentations.